So I'm going to begin with a quick question. I'd like to begin with the basic question, if I may, and please know that any question that I ask is with a view to being educated by you. I'm going to start with you, and then Yossi, if you would follow. You told me that I have permission to call you HR, not Human Resources, but Herbert Raymond. And I'd like to ask you to explain to everybody, please, precisely what it is, what is the responsibility of the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States of America?
Well, the National Security Advisor is a unique position in the foreign policy and national security establishment because you're the only official who has the president as his or her only client. And I think there are really 5 key functions that you perform for the president. The first of those is to staff the president, to ensure the president's prepared for any sort of engagement on national security or foreign policy. That could be presidential travel, hosting foreign leaders, talking to them on the phone, giving press interviews about foreign policy. The second key task is to run a process of collaboration and integration across all of the departments and agencies of the government to ensure that the president has the benefit of best advice and that you get the president multiple options for policies and for decisions that the president has to take. The third key task is to help ensure unity of effort with our allies and like-minded partners. This is where Yossi and I and our teams work together extremely well, I would say, from 2017 to 2018. We just didn't meet and talk. We planned and worked together and developed a common understanding of how we can apply our competitive advantages synergistically to advance common objectives. The fourth key task is to communicate. You have to communicate the president's policies and decisions across the departments and agencies so they can implement them, but also communicate to other relevant audiences, sometimes foreign audiences or domestic audiences. I'd rather have cabinet secretaries do that, but if they're camera shy, somebody has to step up. And then the final point is you're a leader, and I think it's important to remember that you're leading an organization, that you want to provide what we call in the Army purpose, motivation, and direction. You want to create an environment there in the National Security Council staff of mutual trust and respect, where people are empowered and excited to come to work because they know that they're making a difference. So that's what the National Security Advisor does. It's a great job, It's a great job.
Thank you. And Yossi, to you, a similar question. Tell us about the role of the Mossad, and do you also report directly to the Prime Minister exclusively? Talk to us about that.
Oh, yes. I thought it's going to be a similar question, so I prepared. Benjamin surprised me. Again, thank you very much for having me tonight here with you. It's a great honor to be with the Miryam Institute, whom I know for a long time now. I definitely agree with my counterpart, General Master here, McMaster. And beside that, I think that in every given country, which is a kind of a modern and updated nation, you have a very similar structure of decision-taking processes. And this is something that has to be followed because in the end of the day, we all have to remember, if you like him or not, if this is your president or not, if this is our prime minister or the other part's prime minister, if this is the party that we like or this is the party that we dislike, it's not important. This is the guy who runs the nation currently. And he has a lot of responsibility, and something that he has less is time and patience. And you have to have that all the time in your mind, because I was National Security Advisor before being the head of Mossad for 2.5 years. And then we have met, and I've met with the American administration from 2013 and on. I worked with 3 different presidents, in my time as National Security and then Director of the Mossad. And you always have to remember that you don't serve any given president or any given prime minister. You serve the country. And this is something that has to go from within beyond your instincts and beyond your probably personal ambitions. You have to know that you serve the nation. There is a country to keep. There is a country to guard. There is a country that has to have your leadership in order to get the right things from A to B. It could be different policies on the way. Some would say, we don't want to do that. Some would say, we want a policy number A, and some would say, we want policy number B, or letter B. And this is something that has to be very well from your inner abilities to understand that you are that close to the end of the pyramid, but you're not the end of it. There is a decision maker that stands there, him and his ministers, that are to take the most important and crucial decisions to the country that you represent at a given time. So every morning when I entered the same office, I know where you worked, you know where I did. It's either the White House in very secret corner, I mean somewhere there, or in Jerusalem where I served, or as director of the Mossad. You have to know that really, I mean, this decision processes has to be very, very well cooked. You have to know that you have 1 hour to decide what do we do with Gaza Strip. Maybe 2 hours to decide what we do with Afghanistan. Maybe you should have had more time to discuss this one.
Hey,
but
there was a good decision.
I know, I'm sure.
As you know, 2017. That was
right. No, I'm not saying it was not. I said that probably you had more time to discuss Afghanistan. But these kind of decisions, I mean, they have to be like, in the end of the day, nothing is black and white in international policy or in local policy. It has to be digested correctly by someone, and you are the one. As director of the Mossad, it's a different role. Okay, you have an opinion. By the way, in our case, like I think in yours, in the American case, you run the cabinet meetings. When it is the security and policy meetings, this is the head of security, National Security Council, who runs the meeting. You set up the subjects and the options for the Minister of Defense. In our case, some ministers, Minister of Justice. In your case, I know it's different. In American case, I mean, you have a vote, right? In the Israeli case, we do not have a vote. I mean, I can present, but I can say what I think and what my opinion is, humbly so, but I'm not a final decision maker. Mossad is different. You are invited to the cabinet to give your opinion about important stuff. You go there when you have to operate abroad. I mean, I think it has to be explained a bit that Mossad operates only outside of the country. We do nothing inside Israel. I mean, we have our HR, the real ones, technology, it's a huge, of course, unit, intelligence officers, logistics, planning, strategic, documents, blah, 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 all that. Okay, but we do not operate inside Israel. We operate outside Israel. So every move that you do, okay, eventually it goes all the way back to the prime minister's seat. If everything is okay, they will take the credit. If something is wrong, it is your head. And it's a huge responsibility to know that you have to operate abroad in Iran, in Lebanon. There is a Lebanese guy here from Beirut, Ahlan Sahlan, Habibna. And in Syria or in Iraq, in tough places, it's not only in Switzerland or Paris, right? You have to work all over, and it's a huge responsibility. So when you go to approve an operation, you have to know that you have your national security advisor next to you knowing what you're going to present to the prime minister, and he can counter that. Not always that he will accept his opinion or mine, but the prime minister could eventually meet something that is of a different opinions. Some would say, I support this operation. Some would say, I do not. And not always it's a vote. Sometimes it is the prime minister's decision only. So it's a huge responsibility no matter how you play.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. There's something, just to take a little bit, you explained to me last night, I interviewed Yossi last night in Boca Raton, Florida, and he talked to me about the importance of predictions. And there are two phrases that I want to mention here tonight. One of those phrases is, predictions are always difficult about the future. Yeah. And the other phrase is one that's attributed to Mark Twain, and it says that history does not repeat itself. At best, it rhymes. Now, we may be looking down the barrel of a rhyme coming up. You were National Security Advisor to President Donald J. Trump. You, of course, were head of Mossad working with Prime Minister Netanyahu. There could be a return of this partnership, at least in theory. Now, there's a lot of media coverage about these two personalities. I'm not interested in that. People can garner that from the media. What are some of the opportunities, some of the unknown strengths, some of the unknown shortcomings? Yossi mentioned patience and time as an example, without speaking to the man, but to the issue. What are some of the realities of being National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump? And what are some of the realities about being head of the Mossad when Prime Minister Netanyahu is the man in situ? If you could go first.
Well, there are a lot of people here in the real estate sector in New York who probably know him better than I do. Hey, you know, I'll tell you, when I'm writing a book about this now, right? So I'm reflecting on my time there. I was there for 13 months, which was a limited shelf life, but I was at peace with that because I decided when I took the job that I would always tell the president what he didn't want to hear. And I'd written a book about Vietnam called Dereliction of Duty, and I criticized the National Security Advisor and others who served Lyndon Johnson because they told the president what the president wanted to hear. Their argument was that, well, we had to do that to maintain our influence with the president. But of course, it begs the question, what good is your influence anyway, right? So I saw it as my job, as Yossi said very clearly, not to make any decisions or policies. Nobody elected me. The president got elected. So it was my job to give the president best advice and multiple options always, because I think it's through the comparison of multiple options you can see the advantages and disadvantages, the risk and the mitigation. And the quality that President Trump brought to the job that I think was most helpful was that he cast himself in the role of a disruptor, and there was a lot in Washington that needed to be disrupted in terms of policy consensus that had grown over time around policies that were based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. And so he challenged those assumptions, asked hard questions, and I think we effected some very fundamental shifts in policy. For example, as we were getting ready for the Mar-a-Lago summit with Xi Jinping in April of 2017, we thought it would be very important for us to frame a new approach to China prior to that engagement between Xi Jinping and the president and the two delegations. And so what we did in all of the strategies that we developed a framework, Yossi's seen it, of 16 first-order national security problem sets that we had developed strategies for. And on the China question, I convened, as Yossi said, the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, and around a 5-page paper that we had developed. And we did these 5-page papers on each of these challenges. And what they did is they described the nature of the challenge we were facing, kind of on its own terms. We explored, in this case, for example, the degree to which ideology and emotion drives and constrains Chinese Communist Party leaders. We then established really what are our vital interests? What is at stake here? Why do we care? This was very important to President Trump because much of his political base were skeptical about even sustained American diplomatic engagement abroad, let alone military engagement. So what? Why do we care? Then the paper viewed that challenge through the lens of the vital interests and recommended an overarching goal and more specific objectives. We then, very importantly, identified the assumptions on which that strategy would be based, especially those involving the degree to which we and our like-minded partners had agency or influence over this problem set. And then we identified what are the obstacles, what's preventing us from getting to where we want to go, what are the opportunities. And then the paper kind of ended. We had some maybe risk mitigation. And then we talked about the nature of the problem before we jumped into what we were going to do. So first half of the meeting was on that. Second half of the meeting was on what are your ideas from the top down, from the cabinet, about how we can integrate all elements of our national power and efforts of like-minded partners to overcome the obstacles, take advantage of the opportunities. Now you get what we call in the military commander's guidance. Usually in Washington that doesn't happen. There's bottom-up processes, and you get lowest common denominator, and you get policy pablum, right? So I think that we restored our strategic competence in that year in a number of key areas. In the beginning of that meeting, I read an excerpt from the Obama administration's China policy, and I just noted that we were about to make the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And there are a number of other policies where that shift occurred. I think in large measure because of Trump's willingness to challenge assumptions, to be disruptive, and to make those shifts. He did evolve his understanding over time. I think Afghanistan is an example of this. I don't know what happened after I left, but he wanted to just get the hell out, right? Remember, going back to 2013, he was saying, let's get the hell out of it. What are we doing? And what we did is we showed him what that looked like. And when he looked over the precipice, he said, well, maybe we don't want to do that. Do you have any other options? And so he chose the only time, I think, we had a sustainable, reasoned strategy in place for Afghanistan was 2017 to 2019. Now, sadly, he abandoned it. I think people got in his ear, some of the neo-isolationists and others. And that maybe is a deficiency with President Trump. I think because of the nature of his character at times, he could be easily manipulated, and fall victim to the kind of, the problem of who did he talk to last kind of thing, And I didn't see it as my job to try to manipulate decisions on his part. My job was to help him make his own decision. So for Afghanistan, the first option we showed him is withdraw. This is what you're predisposed to do. So I think because of that, it limited my shelf life maybe, But hey, I was at peace with that. That was fine. And so I think that the record of the Trump presidency, like any presidency, is mixed. But I think if you read any of the strategy documents that came out of that period of time, and especially maybe the December 2017 national security strategy, I think it's really hard to argue against it.
Yossi, similar from your position.
No, it's similar but different. I have to admit, because when the American administration eventually decides upon something, it has a lot of echo, not only the White House, outside to the Capitol Hill, and it goes all the way, the things that we care about, like China, Russia, wars, Ukraine, armaments,
Iran.
I forgot this little thing. And when you decide something in America, when the American administration decides something, it echoed all the way back, all the way down, up, whatever, to Jerusalem. And the most important thing is now, when you have partners like McMaster, and when the bonding with the USA is the strongest ever, nevertheless, you can find yourself in different positions, like being the national security advisor when President Obama was the American president. And when you enter the room of this given president, elected American president, whom I appreciate a lot, and you go to the room and you say, we believe, we in Israel, I'm the national security advisor of the state of Israel. I'm not inventing anything. Iran is a real risk. I think that the agreement or the Iranian deal is wrong. And the president goes, and he did, through his national security advisor, Ambassador Susan Rice, and the president himself, whom I met on that sense, and he said, Yossi, you're so wrong. And then you have elections in America, and you go to a different office, or to the same office but a different president, and you tell, now it is President Trump, and I am director of the Mossad, and I tell him, Mr. President, I think that the Iranian deal is wrong. And he goes, you're so right.
Worst deal ever is what he said. Absolutely, yeah.
So it is not only what we want, or it's not only what we wish for, but it has to be communicated rightly outside of Jerusalem. This is what I'm saying, or Tel Aviv in the case of the Mossad. Nevertheless, if we have differences in opinions, and we do, I think that there is a kind of a very important strategic layer that holds these two nations together. And I can give you an example for things that, or I cannot give them examples for things that we did operationally, but I can refer to theoretical things that we've done when we have decided to fight together the Iranian ambitions for a nuclear bomb. And when we did together. And when we said that we have to fight the entrenchment of the Iranians into the northern part of the Middle East, if you have the map in your head, you know you have Iran and then Iraq and then Syria and Lebanon, our neighbors. As I told you before, we would have exchanged them with Canada or Mexico, but you won't cut the deal with us on that sense. But nevertheless, when you want to emphasize, the risk to the state of Israel, and we say we're going to fight together, not only Daesh, ISIS, but we will find the Iranian presence in the northern part of the Middle East so they will not build their military capacity based on Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, directed by an Iranian superhero for them, Qasem Soleimani, if you remember him. Rest in peace or something like this. Thank you for doing it. So we have decided to go doing things together so we can not only guard American policy or an Israeli policy, we'll have to keep the Middle East safer, which is very hard, which is eventually is a very important task. Last meeting that I had, as I referred on the second floor, with the current American president, we had a very open discussion. We know each other from the past. When I was national security and he was vice president, he came to Jerusalem. Palestinian story, two-state solution, 67 plus swaps, all these kind of slogans were discussed, and of course Iran. And then the American administration, together with the powers, have decided to cut the deal with the Iranians, what we call the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is not a deal eventually. It's a plan of action, but it was never ratified by the Congress, I believe. And we didn't like it because it leaves in the hands of the Iranians a lot of risky capabilities. Then Archive came, as Rozita mentioned, and we proved to the world and to my counterparts at the CIA, at the days of Mike Pompeo, who was the director of the CIA, and then the others, that Iran has lied all the way to the agreement, to an extent that we, even us, were a little bit shocked of what we have discovered. Sites, people, scientists, international help from important nations, how to create a bomb, not to create it for civil purposes. And ex-American President, Mr. Trump, has decided to exit the agreement. And when I entered the room at the White House a year and a half ago, so, with this current president, and we have discussed the Iranian thing, I felt that the American president truly expressed his love and care for the state of Israel. Nevertheless, we shook hands after an hour 15 minutes. I was the only Israeli in the room. Of course, Will Burns, current director of the CIA, and McMaster, and what's his name, Jack Sullivan, I'm sorry, was there, our national security advisor, and we shook hands and we say, okay, so we have disagreements. So when you do create a policy down there or up there in Jerusalem, you really have to make sure that it will be communicated rightly all the way to the White House. Rightly means not always you will accept what we say, but you would listen to us. And this is something very important. And on that sense, we have to keep our lines and channels very open. And I think that we can agree on more than 90% of our mutual policies to create the better world. Last word is that it was after Afghanistan, of course, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We do care about it, but it doesn't affect Israel directly, so like it's not an immediate threat to the state of Israel. But what I did ask from the current American president, Mr. Biden, is don't leave Iraq. If you left Iraq, it will be eventually conquered immediately by the Iranians, like 2 days. 2 days. 60% of the Iraqis are Shiite. And the rest, all of them, are being conducted from above. The cleriges, whatever, the ayatollahs from Iran, from Tehran. They receive orders from them. Qasem Soleimani was the guy, by the way, to run the story, to run the show, militarily. And this is something that is important to the state of Israel, but not always comes along or align with the American ambitions and policy. But it has to be expressed. It has to be said openly, as I said yesterday, we can't be shy about our policy in wars.
So you mentioned that there is a broad agreement around about 90% of the issues. I want to start digging into the 10%. And yesterday, and I know this is your view because I had the pleasure of interviewing you in Israel as well, you spoke about the difficulty of arming Ukraine as it defends itself in the face of the Russian invasion. Now, the reason for this is because President Zelensky of Ukraine has said that the state of Israel should provide Ukraine with offensive and defensive weapons, and the state of Israel is reticent to do so, and you have a very good set of reasons behind your opinion, obviously, as one would expect. HR, you take a different view. I've watched you, I've listened to you, I've read your writings on the issue, and you think that Ukraine should definitely be armed, and you support the arming of Ukraine. So what I'd like to do is, I do want to emphasize one of the jobs of Yossi, and I don't know about the National Security Advisor, you'll tell me, but one of the jobs of Yossi is to take himself and place himself in the shoes of the policymakers elsewhere, leaders elsewhere. What are they thinking? So when he speaks, he's speaking not to advocate for their position, he's speaking to present their position. There's obviously a disagreement here. Tell us what Israel's position is, or your opinion is on this issue, and then HR, I'd love you to weigh in, and feel free to have a candid exchange.
Okay.
Friendly so. Okay.
Always, yeah.
Yeah. I think that speaking of or about Putin is a tough mission in America. I think that Putin is perceived in black and white colors. And he belongs to the bad guys. So I'm not trying to defend anything of what he's doing or did. Conquering nations is wrong. Attacking Kiev or other cities in Ukraine is super wrong. But I was trying to explain him to myself. I think as Benjamin said, I mean, we collect, I mean, I have collected, I mean, I do not collect intelligence anymore, about leaders, because leaders count. And we have to know in advance what are they planning for us in Israel. Are they going to fight? They are conducting a kind of a preparations for war, or they are willing to sit with us and sign peace treaties. We have to give our leaders kind of an alert, positive or negative. In order to do that, you have to be in a position to understand who they are and to go into their very much intellectual shoes and say, okay, so that's the story. So in Putin's case, he has his own beliefs. Like if we take out the cards of values of the American nation, it would be very similar to ours. We share the same values completely. Human rights, equality, genders, I mean, whatever. I mean, beside the Second Amendment, we're getting there, bit by bit, but now we're going to be easing the process to get license for arms, but very, very close. Same card. When Putin takes his out, so much different. And I suggest that everyone should try to read his card of values. Because for him, Ukraine is Russia, point. This is part of Mother Russia, the big bear. What is Mother Russia? What is the version of, what is it, Mother Russia? Mother Russia means that these territories for him are his. And he said again and again and again, and my chief of staff here, Anat, who is a former intelligence officer from the Mossad, helped me to find all actual videos and statements and lectures that Putin gave about Ukraine. And he emphasizes that again and again and again, saying, they are mine. Not mine, as Putin, they belong to our big nation, Russia, Mother Russia. They speak Russian, they go to the same churches, they like our card of values. In a given time, he even said it was, Ukraine was invented in Moscow. That's his belief. We have to know, and he has more versions about his views about the world. And we have to know that when he says that, or when he exercises a kind of a war, this is not because he is a kind of an imperialist. He's far away from being Mao Zedong or even Xi Jinping of today's. Nevertheless, as you correctly said, General, when you want to discuss the future of the Middle East, if you want to go predicting the future of the Middle East, you have to have him telling his opinion. Why is it? Because he, together with the Iranian Ayatollah, holding President Assad regime in Syria. By the way, he is the guy that was invited back to the Middle East the President Putin was invited back to the Middle East to get rid of the chemical weapons of the Assad regime that was used against his own people. We didn't want to do that ourselves, so we said, Mr. President, could you do that for us? I said, of course. Of course I will. I think that we've discussed it last year. So when he gets into that direction, when he has this deep relationship with Iran, for example, and let's reverse history a little bit and say the P5+1, this JCPOA, this Iranian nuclear deal as you know it, who was there in the room talking to the Iranians? It was America, listen to that, Russia, China, and then the easy part, UK, Germany, and France. These are the members that only a few years ago were sitting together in one room talking about a global problem. I think that the solution was terrible, like McMaster said, but nevertheless, they were sitting there together. Why is it? Because his opinion is important. Not only that, it could bring the Iranian in and twist their arm, telling them, do it, or negotiate better. As National Security Advisor, I was nominated by the Prime Minister to be the prime negotiator for the JCPOA, for the Iranian nuclear deal. So I had to travel. Washington, D.C., Paris, that's easy. Beijing and Moscow, that was tough. To negotiate with, still, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov, and his team. Parts of the deal were there, were theirs. Each nation, by the way, received a kind of a problem on the Iranian nuclear system and had to solve it for the six powers. Back to Ukraine. I'm not surprised. Are you? You said they're mine. Look at this, 2008 or 9. And by the way, he keeps his promises. And in 2014, when he conquered Crimea Island, what did we do? We didn't like it. And then he said, I'll come again. What do you think? Do you remember, the videos of aerial photographs came from, probably from you guys or from the bridge saying, look at these huge convoys. Russia is getting into Ukraine. And what did we do? We didn't like it. And when he entered, what did we do? We didn't like it again. And we've confiscated yachts and private jets and luxury apartments, and Putin was very much influenced by that. Of course, I'm a little bit cynical here. And what do we do now? And I quote an important member of the American administration, and we had dinner together, the three of us, and an important member from the UAE, the United Emirates, and him and myself, and we're talking, a few weeks ago about the war in Ukraine, and asked him, so, Minister, this and this, what do you think of the Ukrainian-Russian war? And he said, and I quote, he said, I think that in a year from now, you'll ask me the same question. So, Benjamin, I'm not against fueling that war with our armaments. We don't have enough. If you have enough, give them as much as you want. By the way, national security interest of America and Russia is different than national security interest in between Israel and Russia. Russia sits on our Syrian-Israeli border. And you know, when the Russian bear is coming, he's coming. S-300, huge air defense system, S-400. 2 of them are in the hands of Syrian generals. 2 of them are in the hands of Russian generals in Damascus and in the northern part of Syria. And they cover the entire hemisphere. And when an Israeli aircraft has to attack an Iranian presence in Syria or in Iraq, if you let us do that, we have to have a Russian permission to do it. Otherwise, it will attack our beautiful F-35s that you gave us. Thank you very much for doing it. We appreciate that. It's a beautiful aircraft.
S-400 can't touch it anyway. I won't worry about it too much.
Okay. Probably right. But we don't know that. We don't know that. So when we assess the situation, and this will be my final note on this one, and we counter something or we endorse a different thing, we have to understand what is our national interest, what is our national security interest. And again, we can't be shy about our interests. And we cannot bow our heads because of other nations' interests, because it is their interest, not ours. Okay? So, delivery of armaments to Ukraine, do it. I think this is not the solution. My absolutely strategic opinion is that this will not solve the problem. Why? Because Putin has more. Oh, not that he produces it by himself, but China is doing it for him. Iran is doing it for him. And India is doing it for him. And, I mean, calculate these 3 only. It's half of the world's population. The thing that we used to have, like the pure split of the world, in between right and wrong is wrong. We don't have that anymore. A national security advisor from both nations, China and India, I know it for sure, are traveling to Moscow frequently for their own interest. And they don't care about the sanctions. Because you can't sanction China, you can't sanction India. And India is a democracy, China eventually is a little bit less democracy. But it's a different order. And when you asked me before that on the second floor, I mean, what do I predict? Or how does the world change? We are facing a huge and dramatic change already.
So, HR, there's a lot there for you to respond to. I want to tee up your response a little bit, and it may surprise some people here. So I personally, and I'm not being wise after the event, this was my view in advance of the event, I don't think the Russian bear is the bear that everybody was frightened of it being. That's my view. I think we're seeing that that's the reality somewhat with regard to its failures in Ukraine. I also, and I'm doing this to be a bit of a provocateur, I don't believe that the Russians would want any part of any conflagration with the Israeli Air Force, including over the skies of Syria, whether it's immediate responsibility or deferred responsibility. That's my own opinion. And finally, I think there may be a case for the state of Israel arming Ukraine based on a moral cause, right? That's a different view to obviously the one that Yossi's presented, and Yossi's presented from much closer to the plate than I am. And then I'm likely ever to be. But what's your view as an American? Do you see things differently?
Oh yeah, I see things very differently. And, I think because, Putin can think all he wants that Ukraine's part of Russia, but it doesn't make it so. And the Ukrainian people have spoken about that by defending against this onslaught. Russia was the guarantor of Ukrainian security in the Budapest Agreement, one of the guarantors in 1994. So I just think that it is disappointing because of the analogy that is quite easy to make about a relatively small country surrounded by more powerful neighbors who lay claim to the territory, and to say because they lay claim to the territory that is justifiable. I don't think it is justifiable. I think the analogy applies to Israel, and I think that Yossi, it doesn't matter how much bigger Russia is, because what's really matters is is in a war of attrition is capacity and will. And when you compare the populations, you have to compare the populations of the people of military age who are willing to fight. In the first wave of conscription, Putin got all the ones that are willing to fight. He can't even equip the ones that he has now. They've taken probably, they've taken a vast amount of casualties. I mean, possibly, 150,000 casualties. I think they're at the point of moral collapse inside of Ukraine. Now the question is, can the Ukrainians generate the capacity? Of course, without us, they probably couldn't do it. So the alternative would be to not provide the Ukrainians with the weapons they need to defend themselves after we've seen the wholesale mass murder of civilians, including children, the attacks on all of their infrastructure to try to freeze them out in the winter, the kidnapping of tens of millions of children, such that Putin is actually being convicted by the International Criminal Court for the mass kidnappings and child abuse. I think if you don't take a stand on Putin, by the way, and don't help the Ukrainians fight, I think for all of us, that there's no end to this. Because an off-ramp for Putin, if one is provided, is just a chance to look for another on-ramp. And you see that from the pattern of his behavior as he came into office. I know that you've studied him. I think of him as a street thug and a bully and a coward all wrapped up into one. And when he's met with strength, he backs off because ultimately he is a coward. When he's met with people who try to accommodate him and work with him the way Israel's working with him in Syria, he's emboldened. And what he's been able to do in Syria, and you're right about the cause of this, it's the Obama administration inviting him in, inviting the Russians in to eliminate the chemical weapons from the Assad regime, which they've then used to commit mass murder against innocent civilians since then multiple times, including the strikes that we conducted in April of 2017 and 18 in response to those mass murder attacks. But what Israel's allowing Putin to do, and what the Arab states used to be our friends until the policies of the Obama administration, are doing, is they're allowing Putin to cast himself in the role of both arsonist and fireman. And what he's put forward is what I would call Putin's Potemkin peace plan for the Middle East. And he's duped the Israelis, and he's duped others with this plan, which is basically, he says, to the Saudis and Emiratis, but especially the Israelis, hey, work with me here. Help me keep Assad in power. And in a post-Civil War Syria, I promise, because he's worth his word, right? I promise that over time I will work to diminish Iranian influence in a post-Civil War Syria. It's a complete lie. Because as Yossi knows, Assad is much more reliant on Iranian support than he is for Russian support. And the Russians are actually incredibly weak in Syria. Incredibly weak in Syria. I think the IDF could make that, it's just a 20-minute job. A 20-minute job.
To do what?
If they were to challenge you with their air defense systems and their aircraft. I think actually they are, the Russian bear, and the way they've portrayed themselves is not what it seems. And he is, but of course we've created a vacuum with our continuous professions of our imminent departure from the Middle East, right? We had the pivot out of the Middle East under the Obama administration. We had President Trump also, who was ambivalent about it. Remember the pull out of Syria, 2018. We still are there, but saying we were going to leave. And what that does is when you say you're going to leave, it creates opportunities for others to move in. And it's both China and Russia in the region. And if you're going to hedge, who do you hedge with? Mm-hmm. Hedge with Russia from kind of a military perspective more, or China from an economic perspective. And of course, the belief is there that the United States will never take direct action against Iran to block their path to a nuclear weapon. And once you alleviate sanctions by not enforcing them, like the Biden administration has done, you give up your leverage on Iran. So Israel, I think, looks, and Emiratis and the Saudis, and they say, who has leverage over Iran? China does. And it was actually the Saudis who asked the Chinese to broker this reestablishment of relations because they're hedging. And they've come to the conclusion that China has more influence over Iran than the United States, who just wants to get the hell out of the Middle East because they see it as a mess to be avoided. So.
Can I just, I want to refer to, I mean, he prepared me in advance. Benjamin did. But it is important to understand, I think, as I said it in my prologue, I do not support what Putin is doing. I'm trying to explain what he does. Okay? This is number one. Number two is, I definitely agree with you, General. I mean, the willingness, you said. It's not about the size, it's about the willingness. Willingness to do what? To sacrifice? So, are we willing to sacrifice? To help Ukrainians? No.
They haven't asked us to. I mean,
we're not. I mean, we've discussed it again last night. I mean, because I'm dealing with it. I'm dealing with the purpose of keeping NATO so strong. Now, NATO is huge. I mean, probably the biggest army on earth. The strongest army on earth, right? 3 nuclear power nations. USA, France, UK. You have Canada inside. You have Turkey inside. You have all Europe, mostly. I mean, 30 nations, or 32 since the Swedish and the Finnish have entered as well. 32 nations are doing NATO. But not even one NATO soldier is willing to sacrifice himself to save a Ukrainian baby inside Ukraine.
I wouldn't say that.
But that's the reality.
How about an American politician? I think our soldiers would.
No. I'm saying they didn't get an order from the American politicians, not only from America, from Central Europe, from the EU, from the general managers and commanders of their own NATO armies, of the UK administration, anything, nothing. Why we say, okay, this is not our war. Is it or not? So it is important to understand, I mean, first, there is a lesson for the state of Israel, again. With the help of the Americans, and only with the help of the Americans, we will survive in the Middle East if worse comes to worse. No one will come. Definitely not the Turks to help us, right? Or not even the French or the British or whatever, the Canadians. No one will. No one will. I mean, Israel will have to defend itself by itself as we always did. But Ukraine is weaker. Thank God Israel is in a better, much better off since, I mean, because of your help and your strategic support. But you see a huge army that was eventually invented to counter a different treaty. We call it Warsaw Treaty. Warsaw Treaty is dismissed. You don't have that anymore. USSR is gone some 35 years ago. You have Russia. And I'm explaining, I do not accept what he does. I'm explaining. And he says, well, all this huge power that we call NATO, who's their enemy? And he goes into the Kremlin and says, probably us, right? And he calls his comrades and said, what now they're doing? He said, oh, there is a new thing. There's a Zelensky thing here, and he wants to join NATO. So you will have NATO forces in our Russian borders. And it says, over my dead Russian body. He says, no way. Ukraine will join NATO as far as Mr. President Putin is on board. He says this to his counterparts. I think he did. He didn't call me, he said, Yossi, this is what I said. Leaders. I've met with him many times, even in private. Well, smart, well, maybe does not describe him enough. A chess player, maybe better. He understands, like the others, everyone understands weaknesses. And when NATO declares, Mr. President, we're not coming in, don't worry. It was still away, it was out of Ukraine. And leaders around the world were asked So let's say Putin turns his convoys in and push them to conquer more pieces of Ukraine. Would you come in to counter him? One of the leaders said, what do you think, I'm going to open up a third world war? Putin hears it all the way down to the Kremlin. He says, okay, guys, they're not coming. And he was right. No one's coming. So you can supply them with armaments. We can do that too, if we had enough. We have to play it differently than America. I think that America should play it rightly with Russia too. Or, as I quote, not always that I agree with him, Henry Kissinger said, the only missing part was someone to go and speak to Putin. But he knows super diplomacy, right, or high diplomacy. And no one did. By the way, President Trump wanted very much to engage with President Putin, and he did. He did, trying to cut something, I don't know what was it, but trying to. So it's much more complicated than saying he's the bad guy or we're the good guys. If we're the good guys and we're willing to sacrifice, we have to go there and help the Ukrainians. If not, supply them with weapons. And I quote again the American minister who said, about the end of the war, I'm afraid that in a year from now, you will ask me the same question again. That's my prediction. The war will not end before someone will go to negotiate, unfortunately or fortunately, with the Russian president.
Well, hey, I just want to quote G.K. Chesterton, who said, war is not the best way of settling differences, but it's the only way to ensure they're not settled for you, right? Israel knows that well. The Ukrainians know that also. I think I agree with Yossi that what is missing is a vision for what it would take to end the war on terms favorable to the Ukrainians and get to some degree of a sustainable peace where Ukraine transforms itself into kind of an Israel or kind of a South Korea, where there's not a peace, but there's a ceasefire, and Ukraine is strong enough to deter various forms of Russian aggression and is a viable economic state again and so forth, with control of the Sea of Azov, for example. So I think that vision is missing, and there should be two military objectives. One military objective is to assist the Ukrainians in preventing the continued onslaught against their civilian population and their infrastructure. And there are a range of capabilities you can provide to do that: long-range precision fires, air defense, and so forth, the radar capabilities. But then the other objective, I think, should be to assist them in regaining control of all the territory taken since 2014. And you might think that sounds crazy, but I'll tell you, I think it's possible. And I think that once you don't have to go into Crimea, but Ukrainian weapon systems in range of Russian facilities in Crimea make them untenable. And that is a critical logistical node for them to be able to continue any kind of an offensive operation. The Russian army is broken. What does Russia have left? Rattling the nuclear saber. It has horizontal escalation into other areas of conflict. Syria. How about West Africa? How about Sudan? How about Transnistria? How about now the upcoming Bulgarian elections, which more people ought to be focused on? Stoking Serbian nationalism in the Balkans. They're trying to putting tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, right? They're trying to escalate horizontally, to do something more to try to intimidate us and to break the West's will, break the U.S. and European will. He thinks he can do that. But, he might be a good chess player, man, but I think he's past his prime, I think he really blew it on this. He made 4 assumptions that were fundamentally wrong, and I think ultimately will bring him down once it is clear that he has lost. And now, it may not bring the hyper-nationalist revanchist class down. Our friend Nikolai Patrushev will probably still be there, not friend. But so here's he thought, okay, Ukraine's not even a thing, right? This is what Yossi said. They're part of Russia. Well, it turns out they are kind of a thing, and nobody has done more for Ukrainian nationalism than Vladimir Putin has. Since going back to 2003 with the poisoning of a presidential candidate. The second thing he's thought was that the Russian army is really great. They are really great. On parade, they're great. They look really good, but they can't fight worth a damn.
That's impressive.
They were a Potemkin freaking army. I mean, they can't conduct logistics. They can't do combined arms operations. They can't conduct joint operations. The first day of the attack, I said they failed already. They can't do it. They just can't do it. They're incompetent at the senior levels. If you look at that map, they attacked with 120,000 troops. You think, oh, well, that's a lot. Well, divide by 3. That's close combat troops. Look at 4 separate axes. Look at the scale on the map. Realize that cities swallow armies. They couldn't do it. What they were doing was against the laws of physics if you have a regionally competent and determined Ukrainian army, which was the third assumption. The Ukrainian army was just going to fold, which they didn't. And the fourth assumption was that we were all weak. Read the statement that Xi Jinping and Putin made right before the Beijing Olympics. You know what the statement was? You're over, United States. You're over Europe and the West. It's our turn now. We're in charge now. And that's the attitude that he brought into it. And he looked at our weaknesses and our divisions internally in the U.S., but he looked at, Boris Johnson was in trouble for having parties, Macron was in a very contentious re-election. Germany had the stoplight coalition they were trying to form. And he just thought, who's going to take me on? Nobody's going to take me on. And so I think, what does he have now, the great chess player? He's got Finland joining. Sweden will join NATO as well. And I think our will sustain over time. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be contested. Russia is going to do everything they can to divide us, to try to get fears of escalation. But I think ultimately, Russia is going to fail, and that failure, I think, will reverberate within the hyper. He's getting a lot of criticism from that hyper-nationalist class right now, right? The Telegram bloggers who are pro-war. They're not going after him, but they're going after the war effort. I mean, I could go on about this, but there are a lot of indicators, I think, that ought to make us more optimistic in connection with Ukraine's ability to prevail.
So I just want to hit 2 more issues, and then we'll open it to audience questions. But before I do, is this the kind of candid conversation that goes on and exchange of opinions behind closed doors? So people here are getting a window into that.
Especially with our Israeli counterparts. Because, I don't know if any of you know that, but that culturally, Israelis don't really hold back.
That's a surprise.
But I love it. I love it. And then what we would do is we would have great discussions, and our teams would meet in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, and we that framing I talked about, like with China, we would do that with Iran, and we were in on the framing discussion, and then we had common objectives.
And Russia,
and Russia too. We worked on Russia too, yeah. So anyway, I think. This is the kind of discussion that makes us all understand complex problems better. Because I don't think I have the answer to this. These are the conclusions I have come to, at least for now, based on my read of the situation, and I'm learning from Yossi and his perspective.
Yeah, candid, yeah, for sure. It's like talking about an issue from within family members. This is how it feels with America. We don't have this kind of relationship with anyone else. It's not that we say America is the strategic and the best partner with Israel. It is actually the reality or the strategic reality as we face it. But more than that, we say in the Talmud, we say that a sword could be sharpened only on its sister's sword, right? And when we are worried about the same stuff, we're trying to find a conclusion or you trying to find a solution for a given situation. So situation is a given. Russia is conquering Ukraine, destroying it, by the way, to dust. Nothing works in Ukraine anymore. Transportation, health, security, food, nothing, just nothing. 20 million Ukrainians have left Ukraine or have left their homes in Ukraine from their original homes. So second year. Okay, so we see that. Okay, we may have our own view and then our own policy. America should have your own view and different policies. But for sure. And by the way, if America doesn't like things that Israel is planning, they are not shy themselves, right? You don't give up.
Yeah.
Say, don't surprise us, don't do that, and we don't. To your point.
So I opened my previous question with this. Thank you, Alan. I opened my previous question with presenting some perspective from my side as an Israeli that runs counter to the dominant Israeli narrative. And I was pretty candid with that, and people can decide whether they agree or disagree. But you used an interesting phrase in your response to my question, which was that the Israelis are being duped or fooled by Vladimir Putin.
Right.
And I don't believe that.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't believe that the Israelis, because I know people like Yossi and I know the history of the state of Israel as you do, I don't think the Israelis are in the business of being duped by anyone. And I say that...
Here's what I would say is...
Let me just finish the question, General.
Okay, yeah.
So, and I'll explain where I draw that from most profoundly. It's from the fact that when people have threatened to harm us, kill us, destroy us, we, including when we've needed to do it alone, have gone alone. Iraq in 1981, the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007. I wonder if it might be rather, and please agree, disagree, and clarify as you will. I wonder if it rather may be that on the nuclear issue, perhaps America is proving itself to being consistently duped. Israel's got the right idea, and Israel is somewhat behind the eight ball because of a duped American administration. Now, I'm not referring to the administration you worked in. I want to be clear, or you, by the way. I want to make that clear. But can you talk us through that? And tell us what
I
you
think that's right, actually. Okay, so should I plug my book, Battlegrounds? It's a page turner.
Please do.
Just in time for beach reading this summer, man. But in the book, I really talk about how this was a phenomenon in every American administration except the Trump administration. This belief that the theocratic dictatorship in Iran could be accommodated, right? So right after the revolution, Zbigniew Brzezinski goes to Algeria to meet with the new Iranian foreign minister to come to an understanding and say, can we maintain our relationship? Well, what's the reaction? Taking American hostages, right? Then what you had is during the during the Reagan administration, so that was during the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, remember the Iran-Contra affair? This idea that, hey, maybe if we sell the Iranians some weapons, we'll get some leverage with them, they'll release some hostages. Well, of course they release some hostages, but what do? They take more hostages, right? And then that accommodation doesn't work. And then you look at the George H.W. Bush administration, his inaugural speech. He says he talks about them unclenching their fist or something, how we can have an accommodation, and of course this is when the IRGC, the MOS goes global, right? This is when you have the Buenos Aires bombings, you have the Panama air shoot down, you have murders and assassinations in Europe. They became a transnational terrorist organization. And increased the tempo of attacks. Then remember the Khobar Towers bombing, right? 96, I think, where the Iranians blow up our barracks in Saudi Arabia. Clinton doesn't do anything because, there's a new president, right? Rouhani at the time. Rouhani at the time. And he was a librarian, right? And he's going to be nicer. He'll be better, And so how did that work out? And then you had which is hard to say, George W. Bush, the Iranians, through their proxies, are responsible for the deaths of 600 Americans in Iraq. All right, and we didn't do a damn thing about it. We didn't do anything to tell them, hey, we know what the return address is. And this is the case that we made in the Trump administration early is, if they come after us in Iraq again, or wherever else, we have to do something that tells them we know what the return address is. And we did that. And so after I left is when we carried it out. But I think that what is really key is to end the self-delusion. The Obama administration took it to the next level with the JCPOA. And so it is we mirror image, right? We neglect two things. We don't think about the ideology of the regime, which they really believe, and we don't consider the track record, of 4 decades plus, almost 5 decades now of proxy wars against us. And we think, okay, well, now it's really, really going to be different. No, it's not going to be different. And then we talk to their jackass, foreign minister, and he's Zarif, right? Zarif. He's the shop window for them. He even said it himself. He's like, I don't have any influence here. It's the supreme leader and the IRGC. So I think it's serial self-delusion on Iran. And it's been even worse under the Biden administration, trying to resurrect the JCPOA again, supplicating to the Iranians. I mean, think about what we did even after the invasion of Ukraine. We were constraining U.S. oil production, right? And then begging the Iranians to pump more oil, and the Venezuelans for that matter. So anyway, I just think, I agree that it's time to have a clear-eyed view on Iran. And again, I think Iran would behave much differently if we acted like we know what the return address is for these attacks in the region.
Thank you very much. Yossi, on the issue of being duped again, you are someone who oversaw the commandeering, as Rozita mentioned during the words of introduction, the commandeering of the nuclear archives from Iran, from inside Iran, brought them back to Israel, shared those findings with various security organizations and governments around the world. Tell us whether or not, first of all, tell us a little bit about that incredible operation. And then I'd like you to tell us a little bit.
It's going to be a movie. It's got to be a movie.
It's got to be a movie. And then I'd love you to just tell us a little bit about where you see things going with the Iranian nuclear threat. And HR, I'd love you just to conclude our comments here before we take audience questions. Tell us a bit about the impact that had on the American mindset and American policy making going forward. Please, Yossi.
I'll start with the bottom line. I definitely agree with what the general said. Illusions and hopes cannot be work plan. I can emphasize my willingness to do things, but it has to be something practical. In the end of the day, you are CEOs and managers of most of you. Generals that are here from West Point, and all of us. We have a kind of a internal philosophy and a hope, but if it will not be translated into an action plan, it worth us nothing. So the bottom line is, if Iran will turn to the nuclear bomb path, we will have to attack. Point. As mentioned by Benjamin, we've done that twice, in Iraq and in Syria. We've discovered very intrusive intelligence by the Mossad, by the way, somehow held by, but eventually Israeli pilots and an American equipment, F-16 in the past.
It's outside the box, right? This is what you're talking about. Syria.
Exactly. And we attacked it twice. When we felt that there is an existential threat on the state of Israel, we do things. We do things secretly against our enemies, like Mossad is operating secretly against the enemies every day, like the CIA, sometimes with the CIA. And we do things openly. We attack. Today, in Gaza Strip, in Syria, in Iraq, with an American permission, in Iran, and in other places that we believe that we have to take these threats away. But Iran is a little bit, it's much more complicated because of the distance. It's not next door. You have to fly over Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others. You have to get there, and mostly important, you have to achieve the mission, and you have to fly back. This is hard to do. So what we're asking from the American administrations for years is back us on this one. Tell the Iranians, as the general correctly said, if you will go to the nuclear bomb path, you will have us against you. This is what we call military credible threat. What is credible? Credible is the thing. Military threat, you know that. If you do that, boom, boom, okay. Credible threat means that they know that you mean business. That when you say America will get you, they believe you will. If they don't believe you will, and they're looking at us as well all the time. They're smart too. Probably smarter than the others, like in the region, right? Unfortunately, Persians are of a smart origin, right? They're very well educated. They love Iran. Part of them don't. Most of them do. And these that are against the current regime, it's either Khamenei, Khomeini, Raisi, or Rouhani, whatever they are. I mean, there would never be, I mean, the fist would never be strong enough to counter practically the Iranian regime. So don't hold your breath, my opinion. Iranian regime will not go down because of the Iranian people. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to help them. I mean, we do whatever we can. It's not going to be enough because they meet a very strong Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Basij fist, countering them, demonstrating in the streets of Tehran or other cities, Isfahan and whatever. But if worse comes to worse, and Iran will decide eventually, wrongly, to go onto the nuclear path again, we will have to attack. We will have to go there. And I believe, that we will have to go there. We will have to go there. And this is what the State of Israel needs, a credible threat, military credible threat against Iran. So they will not miss up. They will not miscalculate, okay, our strive for a beautiful life. They will not miscalculate our need for democracy to survive. So they will not miscalculate that when we say never again, we mean never again. This is an Jewish Israeli important thing to say. We've done that. We've exercised, all these risks in the past, never did. And yes, we've tried to be, or we have accepted to be fooled by leaders around our history. We cut agreements. Okay, we will pray secretly, but you will not kill us in the afternoons, right? It didn't work. It didn't work. Emancipations and all these big words. It ended up, unfortunately, with the Holocaust. But we had few different kind of Jewish massacres around our histories when we've tried to cut a deal with leaders that from within were absolutely countering Judaism. This we call today hate crimes or anti-Semitism. So we can't trust them. So we have to make sure that if they go wrong, they will hear the voice of our equipment.
General, last word on that, on Iran. Do you believe that if they go for the bomb, or if they're likely to go for the bomb, there will be a strike? Is there the capability to do that?
Yeah, I believe there will be. Obviously, the Begin doctrine hasn't changed, as Yossi said, and I think what's the alternative? I don't think Israel could countenance that regime with the nature of the regime. Again, it goes back to the ideology of the regime and the professed desire to destroy Israel, who they describe as the cancerous boil, right? And I think you have to take that literally, and you can't trust anything that they say. It struck me that when they thought they weren't making enough progress in terms of the U.S. making more and more concessions to revive the nuclear deal, they threatened to accelerate the program that they said never existed. It's just
Zarif,
right? Yeah.
Online.
So I think I just think we have to be realistic about it, and again, the use of force is something you want to avoid, but you can't achieve anything diplomatically unless you have a credible military threat, as Yossi said. So George Shultz, who was at the Hoover Institution, where I am until age 100, he passed away just recently, about 18 months ago. He said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table, and so I think it's in the interest of peace to develop ourselves and to help the Israelis develop a viable, significant military capability to seriously disrupt, set back the Iranian nuclear program.
Thank you. We've got time for some bundled questions. So by show of hands, we're going to take them in bundled, and we're going to take short form answers. So we'll take it in one group. You first, sir, and then if there are other questions, anyone else have a question? One from you, and there's one last one. Anyone else have a question?
I'm going to have to write these down.
Okay, go for it.
So, of course, I agree, and I'm sure everyone else does, with Yossi, with what you've said and what you know behind the scenes. So for the general, would you agree about, is there anyone in the present administration that would give that credible threat?
Man. You know, I would like to say I hope so. You know, President Biden made some very encouraging remarks about this when he visited Israel. My hope would be with the president on this. I think that if you look at the people in the administration who have been responsible for Iran policy, they're the same people that were in the Obama administration. And this is Mr. Malley. It is, and then for the JCPOA, Wendy Sherman is Deputy Secretary of State, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. So I just think I completely disagree with them on their Middle East policy and their Iran policy. So it's hard for me to say, but I was encouraged by President Biden's remarks when he visited Israel.